White initiates with a strong central pawn push, opening lines for development and controlling key squares. A dynamic start. Black mirrors White's central control, establishing a symmetrical pawn presence and preparing for active piece play. White develops a knight towards the center, aiming to control key squares and prepare for kingside castling. Sound development. Black develops a knight, contesting central influence and preparing to defend the pawn. A logical response. White develops the bishop to a fianchetto-like square, eyeing the central pawn and preparing for queenside expansion. Black challenges the bishop's placement, seeking to gain queenside space and possibly disrupt White's pawn structure. White retreats the bishop, maintaining pressure on the long diagonal and preserving piece activity. Prophylactic thinking. Black develops the knight, increasing central control and preparing to contest White's central presence. The move the pawn to d3 by White is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was short castles, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the knight takes on e4, executes a favorable trade, which enables the pawn to d4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to b5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to b3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to d5, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black expands on the queenside, creating space and opening lines for potential piece play. White repositions the bishop to a safer square, maintaining its scope while avoiding immediate tactical issues. Black develops the bishop to an active diagonal, eyeing White's kingside and contributing to central control. White advances a pawn to challenge Black's queenside expansion, aiming to create counterplay. The move the bishop to b7 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to b8, activating the rook on an open file. Afterwards, the pawn on the a file takes on b5, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the pawn on the a file takes on b5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the knight to c3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to h6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to e3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White develops the bishop, pinning a knight and creating tactical threats on the kingside. Black challenges the pinning bishop, forcing a decision and potentially freeing up the pinned piece. The move the bishop takes on f6 by White is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn on the a file takes on b5, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board. Afterwards, the pawn on the a file takes on b5, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the rook takes on a8, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the bishop takes on a8, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the bishop to h4 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to d6, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black recaptures with the queen, centralizing the piece and preparing for further action. White recaptures the pawn, opening a file for the rook and initiating structural changes. Black recaptures the pawn, consolidating the queenside structure and maintaining material equality. White captures the isolated rook, simplifying the position and aiming to exploit the resulting pawn structure. Black recaptures with the bishop, repositioning the piece to a more active square and challenging White's control. White develops the knight, improving its position and preparing for central control. Black centralizes the knight, contesting central squares and preparing for potential exchanges. White exchanges knights, simplifying the position and aiming to improve the bishop's scope. Black recaptures with the bishop, activating the piece and challenging White's central pawn. White castles kingside, securing the king and preparing to connect the rooks. Black develops the bishop to an active diagonal, placing pressure on White's queenside. White repositions the queen, preparing for potential queenside play and coordinating with other pieces. The move short castles by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen to d6, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates. Paving the way for the knight to d1, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables short castles to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to c3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to c5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the queen to e2, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the knight to d1 by White is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the knight to d5, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost. Afterwards, the bishop takes on d5 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the bishop takes on d5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the bishop to b6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to b3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to g6, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn to d6 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen to d6, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates, paving the way for the queen to d2, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the king to h7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to c3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to b6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the queen to c2, guaranteeing long-term space control. White advances a pawn, supporting the center and preparing for potential queenside expansion. Black repositions the bishop to an active diagonal, increasing pressure on White's position. White reroutes the knight to a more active central outpost, increasing tactical possibilities. Black centralizes the queen, seeking active play and targeting potential weaknesses in White's position. White repositions the knight to a strong outpost, controlling key squares and restricting Black's options. Black exchanges the bishop for White's knight, simplifying the position and opening a central file. White recaptures with the bishop, activating the piece and maintaining central influence. Black pushes a pawn to gain queenside space and open lines for potential piece activity. White captures the pawn, opening the c-file and creating dynamic counterplay possibilities. The move the king to h8 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to h5, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the queen to c1, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the queen to g4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the queen to d1 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the queen takes on d1 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the rook takes on d1, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White advances a pawn, solidifying the kingside and preparing for potential pawn breakthroughs. The move the pawn to f5 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to g6, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the king to g2, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to f5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to f4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. unlocking the queen to f6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the queen to c3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White captures the pawn, opening lines and creating dynamic counterplay, but also simplifying the structure. Black recaptures with the queen, centralizing the piece and preparing to exploit the open files. White repositions the queen, coordinating with the rook and preparing for central control. Black repositions the queen, increasing central influence and targeting potential weaknesses in White's position. White centralizes the queen, aiming to control key squares and potentially create tactical threats. Black repositions the queen, maintaining central influence and seeking active counterplay. White centralizes the queen, aiming for active play and control of central squares. Black repositions the queen, seeking active counterplay and maintaining pressure on White's position. The move the queen to c2 by White is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen to e4, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates. Paving the way for the queen to f5, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the queen takes on f5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the rook takes on f5, liquidating material and gaining active play. Unlocking the king to g2 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to g5, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black centralizes the queen, reinforcing central control and preparing for active piece play. White develops the bishop to an active central square, enhancing its scope and preparing for kingside play. Black pushes a pawn to gain queenside space and potentially create a passed pawn. White moves the king to a safer square, securing its position and preparing for queenside operations. Black pushes a pawn, gaining queenside space and opening lines for potential piece activity. White advances a pawn, reinforcing the center and preparing for potential pawn breakthroughs. Black repositions the queen, seeking active counterplay and threatening White's king. White repositions the rook to an open file, aiming to increase pressure on Black's position. Black repositions the queen, seeking active counterplay and maintaining central influence. White captures a pawn, opening lines and creating dynamic counterplay on the kingside. Black repositions the queen, threatening White's king and seeking to exploit the open file. White centralizes the queen, aiming for active play and coordination with the rook. The move the queen to d2 with check by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen takes on h4, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board. Paving the way for the king to h1, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the queen to h3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the queen to c6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the queen to e6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to b5, guaranteeing long-term space control. White moves the king to safety, avoiding further checks and preparing for queenside operations. The move the queen to f2 by Black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the queen to h6, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates. Paving the way for the rook to a8, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the rook takes on a8, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the bishop takes on a8, liquidating material and gaining active play. Unlocking the pawn to g5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the queen to g4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White brings the queen to a powerful attacking square, threatening multiple lines and overwhelming black's position. Black checks the king. A desperate attempt to gain time but ultimately ineffective against white's strong defense. White moves the king to safety, consolidating the position and preparing to launch a decisive attack. Black checks the king, a futile gesture as white's king remains well protected. White maneuvers the king to an active attacking position, supporting the queen and preparing to terminate the game. Black repositions the rook, a passive move that fails to address white's overwhelming attacking potential. White brings the rook to an open file, creating a mating net and sealing black's fate. The move the pawn to g6 with check by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the rook takes on a8, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board. Afterwards, the bishop takes on a8 executes a favorable trade. Next comes the pawn to g6 with check, pushing the tactical tension to its limit, whereby the king to h6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, allowing the queen to d2 with check, forcing the enemy king to find safety. Continuing with the king takes on g6, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White captures the pawn with decisive effect, leading to an overwhelming winning advantage and an imminent checkmate.